That's a very familiar story. That's thought to be the beginning of the prison that we know today. And what I wanted to show in the book is actually that's the end of a much longer story of people thinking about the prison without actual prisons. Thinking about the prison existed long before modernity and long before there were actual prisons in the world. And that's the story that I wanted to tell. So I wanted to draw in the reader who might have heard about the Panopticon and say, well, actually, there's a much longer story here that's important and will change the way we think about what happened after.
Welcome to the Civic Agora, a podcast from the Stanford Civics Initiative, where we discuss ideas on democracy and citizenship. Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Civic Agora. I'm your host, Javier Mejia. And today I had the great pleasure of speaking with Jacob Abolafia. Jacob is a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at Ben-Gurion University of Negev in Israel. And he was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the Stanford Civics Initiative. We talk about his experience teaching in the US, in Israel, the challenges of adapting to a new or different teaching environment. And we also talk about his latest book, The Prison Before the Panopticon, a fascinating book about prisons, their origin, the ways in which we thought about the idea of imprisonment as a punishment in antiquity. And that was a great part of the conversation. I encourage you to stay till the end to listen to a discussion about an institution that is so prevalent in our world and which we don't think enough about its origin. So I think you're going to enjoy that quite a bit. Remember to follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, Twitter X, YouTube, Spotify, and also I encourage you to take a look at our website where we have the list of all our courses, the syllabi, and there's plenty of resources that you might find interesting if you are interested in civic education and political philosophy, political theory. Without anything further to mention, I encourage you to listen to this episode till the end. I want to know more about your path. I want to know about the origins of your interest in punishment, imprisonment. Why don't you tell us more about that? How did you become the type of scholar intellectual that you are?
Yeah, I mean, my intellectual career is sort of a ping pong back and forth between the classics and the ancient world and modernity and the world we live in now. And I started in freshman year in the Great Books program at Yale. It's called Directed Studies. And my idea had been that I was going to be a scientist, STEM sort of biology person. And because that in my high school, that was the sort of serious, and anything else was just sort of a joke. And so I thought that I would take this Great Books class at Yale to sort of read all these books that you're supposed to read, get them out of the way, and then go on and be a scientist, which is what serious people do. And the problem is, I read a lot of books from Plato and Homer and Herodotus and Thucydides, all sorts of names that might be familiar to the Civics Initiative listenership. And I got really interested in them. And I got really interested in the way that the problems actually of the course, the problems identified by people like Nietzsche and Max Weber, hadn't gone away. It's like here was a set of problems that hadn't been solved actually. And I became a philosophy major, and I worked on modern philosophy because that interested me. These sort of problems of modernity that the course had ended with, the way in which even a Great Books program has to end sort of open-ended. There are no final answers. And so you sort of end with modern philosophy and figure out all these really interesting problems. But even there, I wrote my senior thesis on Heidegger's method of textual interpretation. So the way in which modern philosophers like Martin Heidegger, Leo Strauss, Hannah Arendt read earlier philosophical work. And in order to sort of follow that up more seriously, I needed to learn ancient languages myself. So I learned Greek. I spent 3 years at Cambridge in the history and then the classics departments. I said, if I'm going to do this, I have to do this right. I have to sort of return to the origins. I remember, I wanted to write a paper on, Heidegger and Plato, and the great political philosopher Raymond Geuss said to me, "Well, why don't you just do what Heidegger would have done and write on Plato?" And that was sort of the turn. He said where instead of thinking about modern philosophy looking back to ancient philosophy, I just started reading ancient philosophy. And the key moment for this project really is one of these moments where that modern background and the ancient background come together. I was reading Plato's Laws, sitting there in the Cambridge Classics Library reading Plato's Laws, and I came across this passage on the prison, which becomes a very central passage in the book, where Plato is basically describing a penitentiary system. But I had read enough modern philosophy to know that that's a really weird thing. That modern political theory, Michel Foucault, but also modern social science treats the prison as this fundamentally modern institution. But here I was, I had the Greek in front of me. Plato was talking about a prison. He wasn't talking about um, stocks or a jail or a lockup or any of these other things, and we can get into distinction. What makes a prison a prison? That's an important question in the book. He was talking about something that looks like what we started building in America in the 18th and into the 20th centuries. So that was a really interesting problem to me. And that fit into the sorts of problems that had interested me from the beginning, the ways in which ancient questions end up unanswered or persist into modernity. And I took that question with me to Harvard. It was sort of in the back of my head. I didn't know I was going to write a dissertation on this. And Danielle Allen joined the faculty at Harvard. Danielle, I think, is associated in some ways with the Civics Initiative. She's a friend of the initiative. And I sat down with her when she came to Harvard, and she said, "Well, why don't you just write a dissertation that takes this to modernity?" And that was the sort of thing that could never happen in the Cambridge Classics department, because in classics, you stay in the classics, but has always interested me. And here Danielle was giving me permission to sort of do exactly the sort of project that I wanted to do, which is link this history to the contemporary problem. And that's sort of how I moved between those institutions, but also how my thought developed.
Let me ask you more about that, because that's something that I've always found very interesting about your profile, right? Your academic uh, personality, I guess, which is that connection that you very fluently have and are able to construct between ancient thought and modern thought. How how have you navigated that, and how do you think that for a larger audience that issue is important, right? So, and I guess I'm thinking here about the public opinion or the big conversations on democracy, how important it is to reconcile in a certain way ancient thinking and modern ideas.
So I think there are a few ways of looking at the problem. And when you're an academic, you have these various options. You can do something like, and we find these options in Nietzsche. I heard these options in grad school from Nancy Rosenblum. You can be a grave robber. You can sort of go in to the past and like grab the things that seem useful and take them back to the present. You can be a preservationist and say, I'm a historian. The past is interesting on its own terms. It's a different world. They do things differently there. That's fascinating. You can be a genealogist and say, well, this is where we came from. And I think I tend towards genealogy. I remember this moment the first time I went into the Library of Congress reading room in Washington, D.C., and I recommend this to anyone. You can get a reader's anyone can get a reader's card. You walk into the reading room, and they have the initial bequest. They have Thomas Jefferson's library there. And I remember, I walked in, and there was Thomas Jefferson's library, and it was all the books that I'd read in college. It was all the books that directed studies had assigned to me. And the more that I do political theory, the more I think that that's an important fact. This country's institutions were designed by people who read these books. There's a famous book about the Germans, the tyranny of the Greeks over Germany, the way in which German philosophy was impacted, obsessed with Greek philosophy. But that's true for us. I mean, you'd have to call it the tyranny of the Romans over the Americans. So the past really is present genealogically. I'm working on a project right now. Maybe we'll talk more about it. But I'm working on a project about punishment and political crimes and what happens when politicians commit crimes. And if you read the Federalist Papers, they're thinking about Athens and Rome obsessively. So you have this multi-layered connection. On the one hand, Athens and Rome were attempts by people to do some form of collective government, of government by the people in the case of Athens. So they're just interesting examples of that. But they're also examples that live in the DNA of our institutions. So it doesn't matter where you are politically. If you're an originalist, then it would be really important to know exactly what the people who founded this country were thinking about the ancient world. If you're a modern social scientist, you've got to be really interested in the ways that different problems, different forms of social organization can pop up at different periods and do different work. For me, it's sort of inescapable. The history and even ancient history is inescapable when we're thinking about modern politics and modern democracy. And what makes it also really interesting to me is that I'm not naive methodologically. I take modernity really seriously. I take the fact that the modern world is unique and things like economic development of a certain sort are new phenomena. And then that makes the problem of what's relevant in a pre-modern context even more interesting. Because you want to say, well, nothing is relevant. But then, and I think this book proved it to me, I don't know if it'll prove it to a reader, but it proved it to me that even if you take seriously the idea that modernity is distinct and special, the ancient world both has something to teach us and persists in interesting ways that we might not expect.
Let me explore a bit more about your career and particularly your teaching facet before getting into the book. And one thing that I want to hear from you is your experience teaching in such a diverse type of cultural and institutional settings, right? Today now, for instance, you're teaching Israel, which is in many ways a different intellectual space than the US. And well, your experience in the UK is also part of this very diverse landscape again. So tell me about that, and if you can, let's try to land at Stanford, right? So how does teaching at Stanford fits into that landscape?
Yeah, I I always knew that I was going to love teaching the sort of history books that I had been taught, and that is something I do. But something that I started doing in the Civics Initiative is teaching my own conceptual seminars, and so I taught uh, I taught citizenship in the 20th century, which I don't know has appeared on the podcast, 21st century, sorry. And so, that was the hard work, the very hard work of trying to get first year students to care about a set of questions and narratives that they had not been prepared to care about by high school. And I think, that was like the very mission oriented moment of teaching in the Civics Initiative. And I think like taught me both how worthwhile bringing a new set of problems to just a general audience, a general undergraduate audience was, but also how difficult and how unwilling they were necessarily to find what I was value in what I was trying to bring them. So that was a really interesting and challenging teaching moment. And then the very next semester, I taught my own seminar to upper level students, fourth year students at Stanford. And it was this seminar on the idea of progress reconsidered. It was a version of a course that I'd heard about at Yale, but hadn't taken with the political philosopher Thomas McCarthy. But the title of the course had always stuck in my head. And it touches on these problems, these questions that I've sort of been talking about. Is modernity further along than pre-modernity? What is progress? What is progress? Does progress exist? And the way that I formulated the class for Stanford and for a sort of American undergraduate audience in the 2020s was to say, well, progress underlies a certain set of political ideologies on the left, and responses to progress traditionally underlie a certain set of ideologies on the right. So what we're doing in this course is also a genealogy, again, that word, a genealogy of the politics that you might recognize from the world around you, but from the aspect of the political philosophy and the history that lies beneath it. And that class was fascinating and rewarding because I couldn't have planned this, but it was about half conservative students and half, I won't say progressive students, but sort of on the, progressive or unaffiliated side of the political spectrum, sort of think of themselves as like normal Stanford undergraduates. If conservatives think of themselves at an institution like Stanford as a minority. As I had, the editorial board of the Stanford Review, which is the conservative magazine, and I had people who were active in democratic politics. There was one week of the semester where I think Mike Pence had been invited to campus, and you had both the people who had invited him and the people who were leading the protest against him in the class together. So from the perspective of like a civic class where you're getting people to talk to each other, ideal, absolutely ideal. And the class was a huge success, and it was deeply surprising. I had because what the students found engaging, the thinkers who they were activated by and excited by were not who I would have expected. But it allowed students to sort of map themselves and figure out where the resources were for the sort of a thinking they were doing. And I mean, I'll say it was interesting for the conservative students. There was a lot of excitement over Joseph de Maistre, the radical French anti-Enlightenment thinker. These were not conservatives who were flocking to Edmund Burke. And that was really surprising to me. De Maistre is a very sort of outre, out there character who really believes, that historical events are divine, and the Enlightenment is punishment sent by God against the human race. That was fascinating to see a 20-year-old in 2022 or whatever flock to that. Fascinating. But it was also interesting, the progressive students, many of the students were very open to the most radical critiques of progress, the sort of most relativistic critiques that say, well, we don't really have a leg to stand on to criticize the behavior of any other society or culture, which was a left-wing position given by a left-wing, a scholar of religion named Salva Mahmoud, but is not, uh, you know, not on the side of progress, as it were. So the progressives themselves were open to this critique of progress, and so within a classroom with these radically divergent opinions, we were able to have, I think, week after week, great conversations. So that was a huge success. I then taught that class again in Israel, almost the exact same class. And the students were just not as activated, not as excited by these texts. And certainly not by the texts that the American students had been excited by. An Israeli undergraduate finds nothing, even if they're on the right, even if they're on the religious right, finds nothing sort of interesting or truthful in this Catholic reaction to modernity. It just didn't interest them. And so too, the sort of like radically relativist position, just not a lot of people latching onto. There was a lot more sort of acceptance of the more classic liberal Kantian idea of political modernity as a sort of social unsociability that ends up in some sort of unclear progress of moving forward.
What do you think that motivates that?
I think what motivates it is the polarization in the society, which is a radically polarized society in Israel, is it doesn't show up in the classroom in the same way in Israel for whatever reason. And I don't have a good answer. I think the answers probably have to be sociological. Israeli students are a little bit older, but it's just not as politicized a classroom as American undergraduate education has become in my limited experience. And so, if you're trying to teach civics classes that are getting students to think about their lives and the way in which earlier thought might help them understand what they're doing in their situation, you sort of have to look at it from a different angle. And so I taught a class on Jewish and Islamic political philosophy. And a lot of students took the class saying, okay, well, I want to understand, say, Hamas. I want to understand the ideology behind Hamas. And what I'm trying to do in that class is give them tools both to understand their own identities. What are the philosophies that they might not have thought of that structure different Jewish political positions? And say, well, if you think about Islamic political philosophy as leading one place, that's just not right. And there's so much more out there. And you have to understand where political Islam fits in a very, very rich set of philosophical positions trying to deal with the problem of modernity. And that class was a lot more successful. So you sort of have to do some work of understanding your students and where you're coming from. And that's an ongoing process that I'm always doing. But I think my general principle that these texts, the texts of the philosophical tradition, can say something to students in their present moment is true. I just have to figure out what the right texts are and what the right questions are for the right sort of student body.
It's fascinating to hear that, right? To be aware that the classroom is such a living creature, right? it's a different thing everywhere, right? And of course, being like aware of that, it's quite a revelation. Why don't we start talking about your book, and probably this is going to lead us again to your role teaching and talking to larger audiences. And your book, which has a pretty appealing title, if you ask me, it's called The Prison Before the Panopticon, right? And I guess before anything, why don't you tell us what's the Panopticon and why is that the relevant event uh, to frame and situate your argument?
Yes, so the Panopticon is a prison design by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. And that's already interesting. You have a philosopher, very famous philosopher, the founder of utilitarianism, um, and he spent most of his life and a large portion of his time, money, and attention trying to get his design for a prison built. And the design is familiar to a lot of people, either because they've read Foucault, who I'm going to get to in a minute, or because if you go to Dublin, if you go to Philadelphia, if you go to there are places in Latin America, and there are historical prison tours, there are these prisons that are actually built on something like a panoptic design. So here you have this building that is philosophy or a philosopher's vision put into the real world. Now, the vision is based on something that Bentham called the principle of inspection, which is that the person who is inspecting the prison will be in the middle, and they will be invisible to the prisoners who are in cells arrayed around the middle, but they will be able to see. There'll be sort of one-way mirror blind system where the person inspecting can look at any of the prisoners without the prisoners knowing that they're being inspected. And the idea is then the prisoners have to act at all times as if they're being inspected because they might be, and they have no way of knowing. And what it creates is an inspector inside a project, is because that's usually thought to be the beginning of the story of the modern prison. That Bentham is one of the first people to say, well, we shouldn't be punishing criminals by flogging them or executing them. We should be putting them to use. We should be both using their labor. We should make the punishment useful to society and to them. That is, we can restore people, we can make them productive members of society again, and we can treat them humanely. That is, we can treat them usefully. It's very utilitarian. You're both not inflicting the pain of something like execution, and you're producing utility for society by having the prison labor. And that idea becomes incredibly popular. In the years after Bentham writes, basically, the prison gains a monopoly on punishment in Western societies, in the Atlantic world, in North America, in Europe. So something that had not existed before the middle of the 18th century, really just wasn't used to punish people, becomes, over the course of about 100 years, the only imaginable way of punishing people. And so that's a story that's been told. It's a very familiar story to historians, to people who have read Foucault, this idea that, of modern punishment, and it's internalized and people are taught to be normalized and all these things. That's a very familiar story. That's thought to be the beginning of the prison that we know today. And what I wanted to show in the book is actually that's the end of a much longer story of people thinking about the prison without actual prisons. So I don't contest the sort of Foucaultian or sociological story you can read in people like David Garland and others, that the prison is modern. But thinking about the prison existed long before modernity and long before there were actual prisons in the world. And that's the story that I wanted to tell. So I wanted to draw in the reader who might have heard about the Panopticon and say, well, actually, there's a much longer story here that's important, and will change the way we think about what happened after.
I want to ask you about that story in a second, but before that, and this is something that actually triggered my curiosity right away as I started reading your book, which is that it's not obvious at all that imprisonment is the natural way of punishing people, right? And I think for most of us in the modern world is expected to be, right? So it's quite internalized. And so it was like, for me, someone that was not familiar with this literature was quite revealing, right? So about all the possible ways of punishing people, why have we thought about this specific way, right? So the question that I have for you before getting into your story about prisons in pre-modernity or the way of thinking about prisons is, how were people being punished before modernity, right? So what's the, from an empirical point of view, I guess, the origins of prisons, what existed before, and how rapidly you already anticipated that prisons took over very rapidly in modernity. But what's that story?
So, basically, the story is that corporal punishments are the main way to punish in urban settings. And I really am only talking about the West and Europe and North America. I don't specialize or really know about the rest of the world. There are some interesting things to say about Mesopotamia. We do have a poem to the Mesopotamian goddess of jails, but it's a context I can't really talk about. So in Europe, basically most crimes are punished corporally. Flogging, stocks, sometimes branding in the Roman world, especially for slaves. And at various times you might have it, like in the Roman world, there were crimes for free people, or punishments for free people and punishments for slaves in the ancient world. For instance, slave would get lashed a certain number of lashes, and a free person would have to pay that amount of money or an equivalent amount of money. But really, everything revolves around harsh bodily punishments and execution. So capital punishment was just a lot more common. In the ancient world, enslavement, you could be punished in the Roman world. You could be turned into a slave, and sent to the mines, if you were a low status criminal. So there are, but whatever it was harsh bodily punishment. And this begins to change in the early modern period when there start to be in Northern Europe these workhouses for sort of indigent and misdemeanor crimes. So prostitution, other sort of misdemeanors, could be blasphemy is a good example, could be punished by going to a workhouse and having to work. And the idea here being, reform you, turn you back into a productive member of society. But this certainly wasn't for felonies. This was only for, again, sort of a misdemeanor and indigency, the poor. You're basically trying to get the poor to behave and be productive, but you don't. But there's no sense, as we have today, that the punishment itself is to be locked up. Because for anything that really requires serious punishment, you still turn to corporal punishment and to capital punishment. And it's not until the 18th century and this sort of prison reform movement, which starts out as uh, um, a movement around by these religious reformers, sort of Quakers, who see what's going on in punishment and say, well, this is really uncivilized, it's unchristian, and there's a political movement to reform the prisons, and that inspires Bentham. So this is in the 18th century. You sort of have these religious reformers in the UK and the US who are really interested in a more Christian, humane form of punishment, and that's how we get the first prisons. And Bentham is part of that wave of reformers, and of course he's an atheist, but and that shows that by the late 18th century, you're starting to get a broad agreement that harsh punishment isn't humane, isn't civilized. And of course, outside observers, Marxists, Foucault will say, well, also in the 18th century, you have the Industrial Revolution and you can't waste the labor power. So the old way is of putting thieves on the under the hangman's noose by the hundreds is inefficient in an England or in America where you need to use labor power, build things, protect the labor pool. So you have the story that the reformers told themselves of a civilized, enlightened world no longer punishing, killing people because they stole a loaf of bread. And you have later historians saying, well, that's a nice story. Also, the industrial world couldn't afford to maim people, kill people. These are people who wanted to turn back into useful, productive laborers. But all of that happens in the 18th century, late 18th century and after. And before that, basically any society that you can imagine focuses on punishing the body only, with the possible exception of ancient Athens. And that's sort of why the story starts there.
So let's start there. And I guess the natural question is, how are these ideas emerging in the absence of a generalized institution, this is very troubling for someone that doesn't pre-call word, right? So how do you imagine something that is not that much there, at least not in a widespread manner? So yeah, what were these ideas? And you introduce and describe these as two different traditions. Tell us about that, please.
So here's where the book starts on this sort of interesting and tricky note, which is, why would you have the idea of the prison in a world where there weren't any prisons? And the reason we start in ancient Athens, and the reason I think the ideas emerge in ancient Athens, is it seems like there might have been incarceration in ancient Athens. And here, let me sort of define incarceration as penal incarceration, as a punishment where the locking up, the custodial sentence, the time served is the punishment. So you've always had buildings like jails where you had to hold criminals before they were executed, or hold them because they were too important to execute, or whatever the case may have been. But what we seem to have in Athens is something like incarceration as the punishment. And this is a big debate in the literature. There are people lined up on both sides. The evidence is very confusing, but you have all sorts of passages in ancient Athenian literature. I'll take an example that maybe some of the listeners have come across: Plato's Apology. Socrates is convicted in the Apology of corrupting the youth, and the question is what he's going to be sentenced to. And the prosecution recommends death. I mean, he committed a felony, as we've said. In the ancient world, most of the punishments for felonies were execution. But the defense is given the opportunity of offering an alternate punishment. And Socrates suggests, well, okay, I could be given imprisonment. And he says he doesn't want that. But he offers it up as a possibility. And, nobody from the audience shouts, imprisonment, what's that? So this is one of the first pieces of evidence we have that in Athens, the idea of incarceration would not be so wouldn't be out of the realm of possible. And basically, my book starts from the position that even if it never actually happened, we don't have any, court documents that say this person was incarcerated. Even if it never actually happened, people were talking about it and they thought of it as possible. And then we have to ask why. Why did they think of it as possible? What was going on such that incarceration could be a possibility? And I think the first answer to that is something like the conditions of democracy are special. You, for the first time, have people uneasy about being too harsh with our fellow citizens, but also uneasy about exiling them. So, what are we supposed to do with criminals? Do we kick them out of the city? Well, but we want to keep them around. I mean, if you kick criminals outside, they might join your enemies, as happened in Athenian democracy. Alcibiades, you kick him out of the city, but then he joins up with Spartans, joins up with the Persians, really joins up with everybody. So there's the worry about exile. There's something about keeping criminals around, but also there's a question: do we want to just execute everyone? And it seems like during the Peloponnesian War, at some point, one of the governments of Athens, it's not clear whether it was democratic or oligarchic, started imprisoning people for some reason that we don't know. And the practice was available. And the Athenians were thinking about it. Is incarceration a more gentle, more democratic way of treating our criminals? Or is locking up fellow citizens forbidden in a democracy? And it's not clear, because we don't know if it actually happened, it's not clear which side of that debate won. All we can say is the idea was possible for them. They talked about it, and they gave democratic reasons for and against. And so that's why it's a sort of moment that pops out of nowhere in the history of the ancient world, but it does seem to be related to problems that only a democracy would face. And because the debate was happening, we also have the record of another response to the debate, which is Plato's response. So Plato clearly was listening in, and he knew that there was this question about how to punish and what's the best way to punish. And he talks about it quickly in the Apology, but he spent a lot of his career turning over this question of, well, what is the right way to punish? And for Plato, it's not going to be what's the democratic way to punish. It's going to be what's the just way to punish? What's the perfect way to punish? What's the ideal way to punish? And Plato settles on a definition of something that improves the one who's being punished. And so when he returns to the prison in the Laws, in that passage that I came across, he's looking at the prison as a possible way of reforming criminals. And that's why it looks sort of like the prison of the 18th century, is that Plato's theory of punishment revolves around reform. He thinks the only justified way of punishing is to either deter other people, deter crime, but also to reform the criminal, make them better. And he sees the prison as a possible way of doing that. But he's responding to a pre-existing democratic debate that was happening in the world around him.
They're too big, and with this, we're approaching modernity, I guess, pretty like rapidly. But we are there are two big figures that are important, and in your story, um, beyond ancient thought, um, more Hobbes. What are their roles in this story? And I would like to use this question also as an opportunity to open, or I guess dive more deeply into these dilemmas of the prison as an important institution in a democracy, right? So from a citizenship point of view, um what are the relevant elements to consider as a key part of punishing, right? So what's the story there as we approach modernity?
So the two big ideas when the prison reappears after Athens. One is the same idea from Plato, reform. And here, it's that word I was talking about. It's genealogical. Thomas More is a fanatically dedicated reader of Plato. And he gets his Platonism two ways. One, he reads Plato in the original Greek. He's part of the first generation of Europeans reading, Western Europeans, I should say, reading Plato in the original Greek and paying attention to all these things that they hadn't noticed, they hadn't known about before. And so he takes Plato's theories of reform and punishment very seriously because he likes Plato, but he's also a Christian. And the way in which Plato, over the course of 1,500 years of Christian thought, had become an important source of thinking about soulcraft and the way in which souls change and the way in which we train ourselves to become like God. So for Plato, it's this idea of homoiousis theo, becoming like God. For Christians, we're already made in the image of God, and we want to live up to that image. And so these are the idea of how you change the soul, that soul is important. All of that is Platonic and present in Thomas More. And so he returns to punishment and reform, but he adds a new ingredient to it, which is labor. So if for Plato, working can never make you better, only worse, you wouldn't want your prison to have a work component. More is he's a bourgeois European at the beginning of modernity. And he's, an echt bourgeois from the city of London. Who are the value makers in English society? Not the nobility, but the working middle classes. And so how do you improve yourself? Be a hard worker. How are we going to improve criminals? Well, we're going to hold them in cells and make them labor. And so that's sort of the way in which reform makes the leap from Plato into something like this early modern world. The democratic question of the prison, is the prison good for democratic citizenship? Is it bad for democratic citizenship? That isn't really important in societies where the free citizen isn't at the center of thinking. But interestingly enough, I think Thomas Hobbes, who is at the beginning of our liberal tradition, even though many people think of him as a sort of authoritarian, he believes in a strong monarchy, but he thought deeply about what a citizen is. That's why he wrote a book on the citizen, De Cive. And Hobbes understood that the relationship between citizens and rulers is about freedom and the constraint of freedom. That people are naturally free. They're free in a state of nature. And entering into society requires the constraint of freedom for good reasons. And you can see why thinking about freedom and constraint will make imprisonment an important sort of way to think with for Hobbes. So Hobbes doesn't exactly say, we should punish people by imprisoning them. What he does do is build a politics by saying, well, you can only make a contract if you're free, and what being free means is not being imprisoned. So he makes imprisonment and the prison and incarceration this central metaphor for politics. That politics is what happens outside the prison. As long as you're not physically being held down, you're free to agree and sort of a contract politically. And so it makes sense that when he talks punishment, he does bring up incarceration, which is not usual for the time period. But clearly, he sort of brings this question of what does it mean for a citizen to be free into the debate, and he makes physical restraints, the sort that happens in the prison, into the central sort of antithesis of political freedom. So the prison becomes the negative image of politics, and but also something that a society might want to use to make people agree to obey. That is, if you want to get out of the prison, you're going to make the deal that the sovereign presents you. So you have this image of the prison at the heart of Hobbes' philosophy, and you have Hobbes talking about incarceration as a sort of normal practice in a way that I think sets it up conceptually for what happens later. Even though in the world Hobbes lived in, again, incarceration wasn't being used practically. So that's how you have a sort of tricky dance between the ideas and the prison as an image, and a world that wasn't quite ready for incarceration yet from a sociological or empirical perspective.
Why don't we use that to get into the current debate about incarceration, which is particularly relevant in the US, but it's, an active conversation everywhere. And I know you've been working recently on some of this. So how do you think that this pre-modern story can help us navigate some of those debates, right? And feel free to illustrate what dimensions of those debates are you particularly interested in?
Yeah. So one of the things about mass incarceration, and sort of punishment in societies today, there are different ways of interpreting what's going on and the way in which punishment functions in society. Many of the listeners might be familiar, at least with the title of this book, The New Jim Crow, which argues that mass incarceration in America is basically a continuation of racial segregation and Jim Crow and, in a way, slavery and the sort of legacy of American racial oppression. And that's not the theory of mass incarceration that I find the most convincing. And I think it's actually if you look at mass incarceration for a bunch of reasons, I mean, the policy is harsh punishment is popular across racial groups. Everybody wants law and order. And in fact, many of the moments where punishment got more harsh and led to more incarceration are disadvantaged communities saying, we want security, we want safety. And of course, the consequences of those political movements end up working against those very communities. But I don't think you can say, and I mean, this is probably true as social science in general, it's hard to look for sort of one cause, a monocausal cause across history for a social phenomenon. In the case of mass incarceration, it's important to understand there are many causes, and many of them are accidental. but they're all political. So mass incarceration is a political phenomenon. It has to do with prosecutors' incentives. If you want to be reelected, you're going to be tough on crime. It does have to do with racialized political strategies, the war on crime in the 1970s. But it also has to do with things like zoning and the ways in which populations were concentrated into places without jobs that led to crime. Something as anodyne as the borders between where the suburbs start and where the city begins has huge political economic effects on the sort of path of the crime levels in various places. None of these are sort of big plots, but they all add up to something like mass incarceration. I think what's interesting to me is when you look at it that way, American punishment is actually, it lacks a justification. It lacks an overriding theory or rationale. And that's very different than that sort of founding moment, the sort of Bentham moment that I was talking about, the moment at the founding of this country, where they said, well, we want the sort of punishment that's the most humane and the most efficient, the best for making people better. So in my work going forward and sort of wrapping up what I think the book was trying to do, it's trying to get us to see that we should have good reasons for the way we punish. And we probably aren't going to return to the reformative theory of punishment, the Plato's theory, Bentham's theory, that we're going to change people's souls, both because we no longer believe that that's possible. Basically, every psychological theory of reform and rehabilitation has failed, whether it was philosophical or religious or psychological. So that, and we might have democratic reasons to say, well, it's not our place to go inside people's souls and try to make them better. So there are all sorts of good reasons that we don't want to do reform. But this other tradition, the democratic tradition, the tradition that says, well, incarceration and punishment more generally should be good for citizens, for a free society, for the project of democracy. That's the idea that we found in Athens, and to a lesser extent or a different extent in Hobbes. That idea is still available to us. We should measure prisons and punishment more generally against how good they are for our democracy. And mass incarceration fails that test. Political scientists have done a really good job. Vesla Weaver and Amy Lerman are sort of two of the pioneers here of showing that mass incarceration is bad for democratic participation. It's bad for representation. It's bad for the things that are important in democracy. So we have all sorts of democratic reasons to say that mass incarceration is bad. And then we might want to ask, well, okay, how could we make incarceration good for democracy? What would that look like? And here's where my work might look very different. It looks different both than the theories of incarceration in the 20th century that led to locking them up, but it also looks very different than abolitionism. And something like prison abolitionism says, well, we just need to abolish the prison. And I would say we need to think about punishment in the way the Athenians did. Both because it's in the background of our own ideas about punishment, for ways in which I try to show genealogically in the book, but also because they viewed everything through the prism of how do we preserve our popular government. And if that's important to us, then punishment is going to be an ingredient there. We're going to not want to punish people in such a way that they drop out of the democracy or that they're marginalized in democracy. And we're going to want to use punishment in other ways so that people who are really threatening the democracy are worried. And that's a theme in the book, the way that for Athenians, the important crimes, and this is true for Hobbes as well, the important crimes are the crimes that can shake the state. And Hobbes says those are going to be the crimes of the powerful. Those are the really serious crimes. So it shouldn't be a question of how many people we're punishing, keeping us safe. Rather, it's who we're punishing and what we're punishing them for. And that, I think, is one of the lessons of the philosophy of incarceration, but it's also a lesson that comes out of the failures of mass incarceration.
Thank you, Jacob. This has been a fascinating conversation. I hope that we can have another chat soon.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Javier. This has been great.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Civic Agora, brought to you by the Stanford Civics Initiative. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify, where you can discover more podcast episodes and gain access to additional information about the Stanford Civics Initiative. I'm your host, Javier Mejia. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged. Thank you and take care.